Today we'll be looking at a topic that stems out of an earlier discussion. Today we'll be looking at nationalism and decolonization and how by the mid 20th century you have the release from the imperial control, at least predominantly, of places like sub-Saharan Africa, countries in sub-Saharan Africa, as well as parts of India, the partition of India in 1947, and the rise of nationalist movements that helped to spur those along. We are going to be largely referring back to the age of imperialism that occurred in the late 1800s, particularly with the Berlin Conference of 1884, or in the wake of the Berlin Conference of 1884. And what's going to be discussed here is how those colonies that are controlled by the British, the French, the Germans, and others receive their independence in the 20th century. We'll be discussing how nationalist movements that arise out of the late 1800s and the beginning of imperialism become more structured in the early 20th century with the establishment of nationalist movements and nationalist political parties. And we'll be looking at how independence occurs in different parts of European-controlled Africa and India in this period. So when we talk about this topic, right, it's probably easiest to look at this in a map, right? You know, if you look at like Britain, for instance, right, Britain controls this sort of whole side of East Africa. It controls the subcontinent of India. And when we get into the years after World War II in particular, right? Okay, Egypt had already received its independence by 1922, right? But like Sudan does not receive its independence until 1956. In Zambia, 1964. Kenya, 1963. And all of this independence occurs really late into the 20th century, in the second half of the 20th century. In India, it happens a little bit earlier, in 1947, with the partition of India into East and West Pakistan, and India, and then East Pakistan is created into Myanmar, and then East Bangladesh. East Pakistan becomes Bangladesh in 1973. Myanmar occurs at its release in 47. And then you have the French territory, right, of Northwest Africa, Algeria, Morocco, Mauritania, Mali, Niger, Chad, and so on. So what leads to this call for nationalism and independence, decolonization in the 20th century? Well, it stems from the idea of national self-determination. In the period after World War I, one of the principles that comes out of the 14 points issued by Woodrow Wilson in January of 1918 is this idea of national self-determination. But it had been articulated by others prior to that, so I don't want to give Wilson all the credit. But it's an idea that a nation of people should be able to determine for themselves what is best for them, right? And it's important for us to remember that a nation is not a country with a government and not a group of people that are organized into a state, but a nation is a group of people with a common language, history, and culture. So nationalism, at its very heart, is is an amorphous group of people. A nation is a group of people who identify with a certain principles, history, and culture, right? It may have a government, right? The United States of America is a nation. It is bound by a government, but it also has a set of principles and ideals. So it's important for us to be aware that this idea of national self-determination is a way for people to articulate themselves and a way for people to bring that, to control themselves, right? And during World War I, that is, what sort of separates out the people in the Balkans, right? The Balkans, the Serbians and the Croatians, they don't want to be controlled by the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and that catapults us into the First World War. Well, by the time we get to the 1950s and 60s, the people of sub-Saharan Africa, the people of the Gold Coast, the people that will become Ghana, the people of Kenya, the people of Algeria will want to represent and rule themselves. They will not want to be ruled by a far off European power. You also have the two world wars, right? When World War I and World War II ravaged the world, you have colonies sending their soldiers to fight for this war, right? They are fighting to stop German imperial expansion. They are fighting and dying to stop Japanese actions in the Pacific. Britain, for instance, has, in World War I, has Australians and New Zealand's Kiwis, and has, people from South Africa fighting and people from India fighting in their armed forces, and they are dying. And then when they come back into their homelands in the 1920s and then again in the 1940s, they're looking around and saying, okay, so we just fought to stop the colonial expansion of the German Empire, but now here we are, having to submit once again to British control or French control or whoever's control. So that is starting to unravel this notion of the empire. There's years of exploitation from the age of imperialism, right? From the ages of the 1850s, 60s, 70s, and certainly after the 1880s, where countries no longer want to be exploited and their resources taken out of Africa or India or Australia or New Zealand or parts of China. Instead, they want to keep their resources and their industry home. And that will help lead to the revolutions and the rebellions. There's also just a global rise of nationalism. People wanting to break away from larger empires. That is easiest to explain in that way. And finally, when the Cold War begins in the 1950s, you start to see the emergence of the world being divided, right? The Soviet Union wanting to break off parts of Eastern Europe. But certainly as these new countries become independent, they want to separate themselves, and they want to attract these smaller powers away. In the West, they want to encourage those countries to remain democratic or become democratic. And in the 1960s, Harold Macmillan, who was the Prime Minister of Great Britain, of the United Kingdom, will give a speech to the Parliament of South Africa, and he will talk about the winds of change and talk about how there's this sweep of nationalism across the world, and it will be time for these former imperial countries to become their own nations. And it's a huge step, right? Because Britain, at the time the largest imperial power, is saying that this is a time for independence. So these are important pieces for us to remember. And we are going to look at a few different places as case studies in just a moment. For India, their independence is one that took a while to accomplish. Over the course of about 60 years, in India, there was a growing consensus of trying to fight against British rule. And that doesn't mean that other places did not have that. Other places certainly did. But within British India, this was coming from a larger, more organized group of people. Within India, because of the long control that Britain had in India, stretching back to the mid-1700s, there was a large group of well-educated Indian nationals who were vocal and had very good connections. So one of the things that happens is that as young Indian men are growing up, they move to England, and they go to Oxford or Cambridge. And this will be true for many of the men who lead the Indian national movement in the late 1800s. People like Mahatma Gandhi and Jawaharlal Nehru are both educated in England. And for a person like Gandhi, right, spends some time in South Africa and sees the exploitation that Indian workers are experiencing there. And then comes back to India and helps to fight for this. In the 1880s, there's the formation of the Indian National Congress, which is important to be aware, right? They're using the word Indian here. They're not talking about, and in this case, India means all of the subcontinent, right? Not Hindu, not not majority of India. He's talking about all of India. And these are high, very well educated, high class young men coming in. And as I said a moment ago, right, World War I helps to influence this. You have massacres that occur, like the Amritsar massacre. You have acts like the Rowlatt Act that inspires more disappointment, right, as there is a growing feeling of not being listened to among the people of India. And Gandhi, thrusts himself into the spotlight as he works, with the Satyagraha, this truth force, to get information out about how India is experiencing the British control. And he develops these ashrams, which were small communities of people who live together, work together, trying to bring, Hindus, Muslims, people of different castes into communication with each other. He also develops organization to resist British control. And this is most evident with the salt marches. In 1930, there was a movement to tax salt purchases, which salt in a time when refrigeration was not easily accessible. Salt is a lifeblood. Salt dries food. It is something that is crucial to the existence of humans and societies. And the British government wanted to tax it. So Gandhi uses Indian Ocean seawater to evaporate out the water, and get their own salt. Again, this is a way for him to use nonviolence, nonviolent resistance to connect the people of India. Nehru also works in the same way, right? Western educated, Gandhi's chum. And after Gandhi is assassinated, he becomes the first prime minister of India. When India is partitioned in 1947, right, you have a majority Hindu population and a minority Muslim population. And when the partition occurs, when the separation occurs, there's a lot of fighting that goes on, because people are very nervous that the Hindu majority will put down and suppress this Muslim minority. And as the separation of the country has emerged into East and West Pakistan and India, there are millions of people who are killed in this respect, and millions more who are displaced as refugees. The final place we'll look at here is South Africa, right? When South Africa receives its independence, it receives its independence into the Union of South Africa in 1910, but the people who are in charge are the white settlers. They are the minority. They're the ones who own the most property. They're the ones who have the greatest amount of wealth. And there's a huge majority of people who are Black South Africans. And this idea of national self-determination starts to bubble up for them. How can it be that this majority of people is forced to be subservient to this minority of people. And you have emerging out of this that educated class, just like we saw in India, of which they form the African National Congress. And out of this comes people like Nelson Mandela. This also taps into a larger movement, which is the Pan-African movement. The Pan-African movement looked to connect all people from Africa, and even within the global Pan-African diaspora, to try and fight for better treatment of people of African descent and of the countries within Africa. However, there are major problems, right? South Africa is a very diverse place. There is people who are of English descent. There are people who are of Dutch descent. And then there are Black South Africans who are neither of them. And there are these three competing groups, none of which, I should say the English, British, and the British side and the Dutch Afrikaner side, they are nowhere near majorities. And there's these competitions that are emerging among them. Stretching back into the 1880s, there's the system of apartheid that separates out where Black South Africans are able to live and where, and jobs that they're able to have. There are laws passed that say that they have to travel with certain ID cards. All of these things, right, help to inspire greater sentiments of discontent among Black South Africans. And it's important for us to realize, right, this is already an independent country of South Africa by 1910. So, in 1994, when the first free and fair election occurs and Nelson Mandela wins, right, that's what we're talking about in terms of independence, right? There's already an independent nation, but giving the people who are actually being represented the right to vote, and Black South Africans getting the right to vote in 1994 is important. It's important for us to be aware, right, that independence is not the same for every nation, right? India and South Africa, to a lesser extent maybe, had a system of well-educated, articulate groups of people who were capable of running the government, right? In other parts of the world, right, in other parts of Africa in particular, you have a place like the Congo, which had been exploited by the Dutch for hundreds of years, by the Belgians, for hundreds of years, or for 100 years. And when they received their independence in the 1960s, there's only something like 10 college graduates in the entire country of the Congo. Their resources had been exploited by the Belgians. So what you see happening is independence is not easy for places like that. And that doesn't mean that India's independence was particularly easy or South Africa's rise towards national self-determination was. But these things are complicated. So nationalism and the exploitation that occurs during imperialism helps to bind these groups of people together. And Black South Africans are going to be bound together by their experiences. And this will lead to the rise of these nations receiving independence and national self-determination in the second half of the 20th century.